all these innovators that are listening to you say, I've got this gap here, I've got this need, I've got this challenge, they've got a vested interest in solving that challenge. And the best example I can give is, during the pandemic, when all the ships and stuff were like stuck off the coast, right? And everyone's going to say, or everyone was saying, hey, are we going to be able to have Christmas this year? Well, I'm thinking like, yeah, we are. You know why? Because there's a whole bunch of innovators going to figure out how to get that stuff off those boats, because that's money right there, baby. And when there's money at play, you're incentivizing people to get creative, to push outside of their comfort zone and figure it out.
Without supplies, there's no surgery. Without products, there's no patient care. Welcome to Power Supply, the healthcare supply chain podcast focused on helping you navigate the intricacies of logistics, purchasing, contracting, and supplier relationships. Each episode, we speak with healthcare executives, supply chain leaders, and innovative entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the loading dock to strategic sourcing, from buyers to the C-suite, and across the enterprise, we tackle the real-life issues impacting the healthcare supply chain. Whether you're tuning in for conversation or inspiration, we're glad you're here. You're just in time to hear it from the source and stock up on insight. So sit back and plug into Power Supply.
Today, we are speaking with Hank Balch, founder and president of Beyond Clean, and actually, little known fact, also the co-founder and president of Power Supply. Hank and I started Beyond Clean a little over 5 years ago in 2017. We'll tell a little bit about that story today, but we're going to give you some tips in supply chain about areas of focus for sterile processing if you have oversight of that department, and talk about the power of social media and networking on learning and the evolution of our professional development, especially with a lot of new blood coming into supply chain, Hayes.
Hey, listen, there's nobody in this business, in this industry, that's better connected, knows more about social media than Hank. And actually, kudos to you and Hank. Y'all have done a great job growing this brand. And, if you're listening to this, thank you. We need everybody to be a part of this. But again, Hank is such a good, not only is he really good at what he does, he's such a good guy. And I think it's so evident in listening to him today. So, I appreciate him coming on.
All right. Hank Balch up next. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
I'm Hayes Walder.
This is Gary Skinner.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
A production of 17 Studios. You're listening to Power Supply.
Joining us now is my dear friend and business partner, Hank Balch, founder and president of Beyond Clean, as well as, little did you know, Power Supply, and the entire family of podcasts that also include First Case and Transmission Control. They all speak to different audiences in healthcare, but really Hank is the social media genius, content creator, and really just entrepreneur extraordinaire. I'm the businessman behind it, but he is the brains, the mind, and the visionary.
And the beauty.
So
the beauty. Don't forget that. Look at that face.
The beauty of the beard.
Yeah.
You can't even see his face.
Dude, it's amazing.
Yeah. It's a shame this is not a video podcast, because you're right, the beard would really carry through video well. But yeah, Justin, thank you for letting me out of my little cage. It's nice to be able to be on a platform that I helped start a couple years ago. It's been a long time coming, and it's been really cool, though, to sit on the sidelines for this one, to see all you guys with the the perspective of the industry to grow this platform to what it is today. So I'm really excited to talk.
Well, when we talk about building the platform, obviously central to what we do and everything is really your vision for social media and the power of social media for networking. And that's going to come into the conversation today for sure. But so is your experience in sterile processing. And we want to talk, to all the supply chain folks out there. And many of them actually got their start in sterile processing. We see that a lot. Sterile processing to materials management, climb the ladder. That was probably the first track, I would say, or career development track for sterile processing professionals to kind of move up in the healthcare organization. Typically, it went through materials and ultimately supply chain. So I know a lot of people listening are going to have familiarity with SPD, but why don't you talk about your past in sterile processing and how social media even comes into the picture, including what we're all doing today?
Sure. So I'll start at the end of that and take us back to 2017 when we were talking about starting a podcast about sterile processing, right? The most random thing in the world, and you would think, who on earth would listen to a podcast about a really, really specific job, and what on earth would you talk about? And here we are 5.5 years later on the Beyond Clean platform, still going strong and still taking over the world with content and education and networking. And so, bring that back into the beginning of my sterile processing career. I started in 2009. The internet was not new. We already had Facebook, we already had LinkedIn, and had a lot of stuff was already out there. But as a brand new technician and professional in healthcare, I looked around and said, I want to learn about this job. I want to get connected. I want to grow. And the resources were extremely limited. I couldn't do a lot at the beginning because I was still trying to learn the job and figure out, do I want to hang around here or not? I ended up really liking it, still in the sterile processing industry today. But to fast forward, I was nominated and ran for the president of our trade organization over in sterile processing and lost. That summer, you reached out to me, Justin, through LinkedIn, and this is going to come up again, through LinkedIn and said, hey, man, I've been connected. Someone told me to follow your content because you're talking a lot about sterile processing on your page. Have you ever thought about starting a podcast? And if you want to read that conversation, it's actually on our website over at beyondclean.net. And we took screenshots of the LinkedIn conversation. It's kind of cool. And I said, I thought about it, but I couldn't do it by myself. And next thing led to the launch of Beyond Clean in 2017. But here around the power supply conversation, we're going strong, for about 3.5 years. We kept getting these questions from our sterile processing audience and other folks that are interested in what we're doing. How many supply chain leaders do you have that listen to your show? Because we talked about some of the topics and the issues around supply chain that touch sterile processing directly. And we were always like, they're there, but they're not really the target audience. But that question kept coming up enough times, and we looked around and said, hey, is there anyone out there that's doing what we were doing in sterile processing in supply chain? There were some people out there having conversations, there were some podcasts, but no one was really taking the approach that we do in our podcast and with these platforms. So I don't have to tell you guys, but we launched Power Supply at the beginning of 2021, and it's been crazy to see the growth since then.
Well, we're recording this podcast the same week that we launched our very first episode approved for continuing education credits. So we'll continue to kind of promote that. But I want to talk about education and the gap. You alluded to it, but I don't think you really explained it, especially in a parallel to supply chain. But just what does social media represent in terms of the ability to bring information, especially information to the audience? So I really want to talk about the parallels between sterile processing and supply chain when it comes to just the power of networking and having information curated for that audience and really coming out to the audience, right? Traditionally, when we learn and we get educated, we're invited to come to the educator, right? And I feel like what social media has done is it's taken that information and now it's coming to you instead. Can you talk about how that has had such a revolutionary impact on sterile processing and why supply chain professionals should keep it in mind for, what I think we're just on the precipice of realizing in healthcare supply chain?
Yeah. So, we got robots in our operating room, right? And we got supply chain leaders out there who can't quite figure out how to navigate the social media landscape, not to consume information, but to create and share the information and insight that they've got over decades and decades in the space, right? So we got a tremendous amount of experts out there in the space. They know what they're doing. They're speaking at conferences, they're getting published in trade magazines, but then you bring them to the social media space, and many of them are lost. And so the opportunity was exactly the same in sterile processing, right? Like going back to where I started in 2009, the same people, the same insight, the same perspective, everything was there, but there was that gap in the tools, in the value in the tools. And, early on in kind of the launch of the show and all the conversation around podcasting, right? Like we were explaining to people, what is a podcast? Well, if you're listening to this, we don't have to tell you what a podcast is, but that was a real conversation even back in 2017 on what is this thing that you're asking me to listen to and why. But you fast forward out of that and the impact that you ask that the platform has had on the sterile processing industry. And I don't want to overstate it, but it's pretty dramatic and it's pretty quick. Again, I didn't think, and we didn't think anybody was even going to listen to this podcast. We wanted to do it because it was fun and because we had things that we wanted to talk about. We had people that we wanted to talk to, and that's great. What happened is we hit that gap that you're speaking of, the connecting this expertise out here through these new platforms into this massive audience at the other end that wants to consume content through these platforms, not the old-fashioned way through magazines, not the old-fashioned way only through in-person events, but they want to consume now through these new channels. And there wasn't a conduit in sterile processing back in 2017, and even in supply chain in 2021. There were some conduits, but there wasn't a big conduit committed to particularly social media, to leveraging the tools in social media to pull these people out of the shadows, get that insight on the big stage, and then connect everyone through those conversations. And honestly, that's been the most magical thing. I think we've shared this on the other podcast before, but they don't tune in to listen to Justin and I, and they don't tune in to listen to Hayes and Gary.
Come on now. Come on. Gary says they do.
I mean, maybe this podcast is different. Maybe they do tune in to hear you guys. But, on the other shows, they're tuned in because you're talking to somebody different every single week. Different insight, different experience, different perspective. And they can't get that anywhere else in the market today. And it's just really cool to see.
Hank and Justin, I appreciate you guys setting this up and actually including some guy from Idaho. Obviously, Hayes is a big deal. He's like a celebrity. We all know that. But, I remember the days, we just talked to Bob Yokel. I think I had cassette tapes. It was cassette tapes. I think I was throwing in my player. I'm just going to throw it out. But seriously, you talked about the gap. It used to be go to Salon A, Salon B, Salon C in Tennessee at the Gaylord Resort, and you would go try to get all your content and crush it, right? Now, travel, listen, what a medium. And so I guess taking that to the next step on just where we're going, where we're at with Power Supply, do you see it trending? And in that matter, First Case and the rest is, are we trending along with where Beyond Clean is? Beyond Clean is huge. It's huge. It has taken off like crazy and obviously pummeled that market. Is Power Supply rolling in that same direction? Is it trending?
Well, the awesome opportunity with healthcare supply chain is it's so much bigger. Like you think about sterile processing, it's a big industry because we got some big companies that are selling into this space. Like you think the big multinationals, right? 3M, STERIS, the big names are in there. And there's a lot of innovators, right? So we got the whole scope there, but that's just like one little bitty slice of what's happening in surgery. Supply chain touches it all from beginning to end, the contracts,
doc to doc,
you name it. It's all over.
Doc to doc, baby.
Yeah. Which it means the audience is that much larger to reach. But the challenge is now, because you're not in a niche, it's a much bigger playing field to create content that's still applicable to that end user in the supply chain hospital. What are those supply chain managers and directors? What are those VPs? What do they need to know? What do they want to know? Who do they want to hear from? That's a challenge that I think you guys have been hitting it out of the park. And the great thing about podcasting and about social media is you create a library. So like you mentioned those live events. You go, you have a great experience, but if you didn't make it to the live event, you're out of luck. If you did make it to the live event, you got to try to remember that awesome presentation, 6 months later, and you're also, again, probably out of luck. But with the podcast, all of this stuff is just being banked into this massive library that, 3 months from now, if a brand new supply chain manager gets their first promotion into management, they're like, oh crap, I'm not prepared. I don't know what these conversations are having. I don't know how to negotiate. Where do I go? They search Power Supply, and then boom, they're introduced to all of these names, all these concepts, all these resources. I mean, that's where the magic is, and that's where people just kind of miss the value of what exactly it is that we're doing over here.
I also want to talk about the importance of increasing awareness of existing information too. So you talk about that library, again, we mentioned the partnership with ARM. There's tons of content on the ARM website, but how do you promote that? How do you make sure that there's continued awareness of it? Social media gives us an opportunity to continue to bring that forward, continue to remind people where resources are. I think getting involved is also about, hey, this is a hot topic that's coming up right now. Power Supply had a podcast, a year and a half ago on this topic. ARM's got these resources on their website. You can literally curate a whole library of resources in one social media post as soon as something really hot as a topic or something that needs to be addressed immediately. And you can package that all up. Or you can just search a hashtag. And these are ways to grab that information when you need to be educated. Supply chain, like none of our other curated content audiences, touches so many different topics. You have to know so much about so many things. So being able to find that information and pull that out so that you can really ramp up your knowledge base, I think is really critically important. And I want to talk about how it relates to innovation, because supply chain needs a lot of innovation right now. I think we're all aware that investing resources into supply chain is something that's really going to be needed with the staffing crisis, et cetera. Sterile processing was the same way. When we brought in accountable care, all of a sudden we had this scenario where if you were readmitted with a surgical site infection, then hospital is going to get hit financially on that because they were going to have to eat that cost. All of a sudden, dollars started going into innovating in sterile processing. I feel like the pandemic has called a very similar attention to supply chain, and there's a parallel there. What I think that you can share is you've shared so many stories on the Beyond Clean podcast about innovation that was led by, visionary type conversations on the show with frontline leaders and frontline technicians who said, my job is really tough. And if I had this, it would make a difference in my day to day. And then actually we've heard from innovators in the industry that have taken discussions that we've had on that podcast and put it into practice.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, that's where the magic happens, right? It's that synergy of bringing the ideas in front of the people or the teams that can do something with the idea. If you're a supply chain manager, if you're a sterile processing manager, you've got a role and responsibility of keeping that hospital going today, tomorrow, next month, not necessarily develop the next new thing that's going to be able to scale across the industry to solve the problems. But all these innovators that are listening to you say, I've got this gap here, I've got this need, I've got this challenge, they've got a vested interest in solving that challenge. And the best example I can give is during the pandemic when all the ships and stuff were stuck off the coast, right? And everyone's going to say, or everyone was saying, hey, are we going to be able to have Christmas this year? Well, I'm thinking yeah, we are. You know why? Because there's a whole bunch of innovators going to figure out how to get that stuff off those boats, because that's money right there, baby. And when there's money at play, you're incentivizing people to get creative, to push outside of their comfort zone and figure it out. And the same thing's going to happen here in supply chain. It's not just about the money. There's a patient at the other end, but there's a lot of interest and there's a lot of incentive for innovators to be listening to podcasts just like this, because they're hearing now the voices from inside the hospital. They're telling them what they need or what they don't have, or maybe even they're just asking questions that the innovator's yep, I've actually got the answer to that. And it does. It happens. And, big ideas and big inventions are born of it.
So I want to talk maybe a little bit more granular about sterile processing, because I drew that parallel to bridge the gap, because another big, focus, I think, of this interview is giving some insight into what's going on in sterile processing and where maybe they might look for those innovations. So a big part of, obviously supply chain's role is to support the departments that they oversee to bring those kind of innovations, technology, cost savings, et cetera. Can you talk about where sterile processing is resource starved and maybe some of the movements that have really come into place that if there's a supply chain leader listening to this today and they just wanted to do like a 10, checklist, does my sterile processing department have these 10 things? What is critical that maybe we didn't have 10 years ago that they should really be looking at that could also yield some savings either from operational efficiencies or otherwise?
Well, the biggest thing that we have today that we didn't have then is data. We are getting more data than we've ever had on sterile processing. Not every department out there is on a tracking system or an asset management system, but many more are today than were even 2 years ago, 3 years ago. So with all that data, that's given you decision-making power now on your surgical instrument inventory, on your staffing, on your purchase services, on your equipment. You name it. Now we've got data to say how many loads are going through that autoclave, how many loads are going through that washer, how much detergent are you using, right? So like you talk about your chemical contracts, right? Now we can actually drill down and say, this is what we need. This is what we use. And you talk about chemical conversions, you got data to bring to the table. The challenge around there and the opportunities for innovation is we got a lot of data, but we still don't have a lot of people or tools to pull that data together in a format that the sterile processing leader can do something with it and that the sterile processing leader can take it to supply chain and it actually mean something to them to be actionable data. That's changing rapidly, especially in that little crossover section between sterile processing and implant management, for instance, because those implants obviously are coming through SPD before they're getting to the OR many times, or at least they're associated with the instrument trays that we're processing. So that piece, I think we're seeing rapid innovation around. The other kind of broad categories, I know I jumped first to data, but time, tools, and training would be the categories that I would throw out. We're short-staffed just like everybody else in healthcare. Because of that, when we're hiring people on, many times their training is getting short-circuited because we need them. We need them on the floor. We need them processing, but a lot of problems and risk associated with short-circuiting your training when it comes to reprocessing. That tool aspect, again, I can't tell you how many departments that we go to on the consulting side of things that just do not have adequate equipment to be supporting the surgical volume that they're doing. This is even worse in the ASC setting, for instance. They got like one washer in there and they're churning through now orthopedics at a mile a minute. And, this poor sterile processing technician back there is caught between a catch-22.
Might be a surgical tech without any sterile processing experience too.
Flash. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So it's a crazy world out there in that dynamic because the investment hasn't been there for years and years and years. And now there's even less money than there was prior to the pandemic to invest in. So yeah, there's a lot of risk. It's not to say that everybody out there is doing a bad job. They're doing as best as they can with the tools and training that they have, but there's a lot of need for support from that supply chain leadership into the trenches in sterile processing and really say, hey, what do you need to not only be compliant, but also to stem the tide of the burnout that's just going to lead to more staffing shortages that we're seeing across the industry today.
I think one of the things that nobody's really solved for too, and why that training piece is so important, is there are a lot of competing IFUs and industry guidelines and expectations. And there are often times where sterile processing is almost making a decision between the lesser of two evils. Like, what's the best decision in this situation? And I don't know that there's always a lot of excellent guidance, and there actually winds up being a lot of debate. And I want to tie this into the power of networking, because one of the things that's very difficult to train is critical thinking and analytics. And I also believe that there's a lot of short circuiting in the training and in the supply chain realm, because it's very difficult to just bring somebody in and not put them to work right away. But one thing that many SPD departments have that I don't know of any supply chain departments having is an educator who leads the professional development and growth of these individuals when they come onto the team? And I feel like at least having a forum like on social media to talk through some of that is how we can really foster that soft skill.
Right. Yeah. What's unique in kind of comparing the two industries, again, as an outsider looking in, is this education piece. In the sterile processing kind of world, there's not really required college degree. There is no college training program that you could pursue that would prepare you in any form or fashion to work in or to manage a sterile processing department. It's not the same with supply chain. There are supply chain degrees out there. There's logistics degrees. Like, you can really professionalize, and the industry has been in large part becoming more and more professionalized. There's still a lot of folks that work their way up inside the hospital, like you described, Justin, from various departments and areas into materials management and supply chain. But there's a lot of colleges now pumping out graduates that have the book learning that now need the orientation into the healthcare setting or into the organization. So that's a different dynamic. But I will say, it kind of goes back to the vision for this podcast. I envision a lot more self-training going on for those new supply chain leaders that have the critical skills to say, okay, I don't know this. I need to figure it out. Now, where do I go? And it's podcasts and platforms like Power Supply that give them one of those answers.
I think a lot of people are uncomfortable with social media, and, especially, I can tell you even just from the podcast itself, I had moved into being my own boss and being an entrepreneur before I ever reached out to you and said, hey, let's start this podcast, right? When I had a singular employer, I was pretty nervous about putting out podcasting content, because what if what I said isn't approved or accepted or, really wanted to be spoken on by my direct employer? And maybe they didn't feel like I represented the organization well. How can people listening to this podcast take that leap without worry or fear of misrepresentation or retribution from an organization? I realize that they can simply be content consumers, but you said something at the very beginning that I think is really important, especially when it comes to the thought leaders that are in the industry. And, they may not want to share all their secrets, but I do think that we really haven't got that information out into the world to have a greater impact on healthcare supply chain, on the whole as an industry.
Well, social media gets a kind of bad rap. It's like a boogeyman out there, and we put it in categories kind of its own, but then we don't do a good job of comparing it to other things that we're more comfortable with, right? So getting published in a magazine, like, everybody's comfortable with that, right? No one has an issue with like giving an interview or, writing an article, getting it published in Healthcare Supply Chain Today or whatever it's called. And the reason being is because we're comfortable with that form of media. Same thing, conferences like Gary mentioned, right? We're all comfortable going and presenting at a big national conference. Why? Because we're comfortable with that platform. But it's the exact same information and content. It's just delivered in a different fashion. So part of the whole comfort level with social media is just, we need to realize it's a media conduit. There's nothing crazy about social media that it does to the words you say or the content that you share. If you're doing the same content, if you're using the same words that you would as if you're speaking in person or if you're being published in a magazine. That being said, I think healthcare systems and entities are still trying to figure it out in terms of policies, especially during the pandemic. We saw all the stuff about dancing nurses and like all the blowback and stuff for that was happening on, places like TikTok and other things. Like, I didn't see a lot of dancing supply chain managers. So the audience was probably not involved in that piece. But, there's sides of social media that give less value. Those are like the puppy dog photos and, the random things that you see on Instagram.
Oh, Hayes is offended.
Yeah.
You just hit his hot button.
You love the puppy dogs.
I can share some puppy dog faces and things. Yes.
Yeah. So, there's that side, and that's fine, right? Like, it's a good use of social media. But the side of social media that we're talking about is the side that professionals go to consume content that impacts their career and impacts their hospital and their industry. And I just want to kind of wrap with this piece, Justin. Like you mentioned the difference in consuming and creating. And in large part, that's the biggest gap. I mean, it's a massive gap. There's a lot of consumers of content out there. I mean, a tremendous amount of hungry supply chain folks that want to know more. And they're coming to LinkedIn, they're coming to social media, they're coming to podcasts. They're like, they want to know more. But then you flip it and look around and says, who on a weekly basis is creating new supply chain content that this audience can consume? And that number is very, very small.
Is that what it's going to take to truly move the industry?
Yeah. I mean, without people that are willing to bring that content to the space. And this is the crazy thing, like Bob Yokel you brought up, he's been around for a long time. But, the one thing that I respect about Bob is he sees it's digital space, and he's willing to bring that content into the digital space through digital magazines. Like he's written a number of the articles on the go for the Power Supply podcast that folks may have heard. Like he's bringing that same insight across those traditional barriers of media into the new media. And that's what we need. We're not asking people to change what they're talking about. We're just changing how it's delivered through podcasts, through virtual events, and again, through that news feed that you see on your social media page.
Well, I think you and I are believers in the power of social media. I know Hayes is as well. He's quite a content creator. I think it's time to shine the spotlight on Gary. Gary, we need more. We need more content.
He's better I'd rather just listen to him rather than look at him. I don't know if we need to.
Oh my God, you're killing me. That darn Tennessee Volunteer always throwing stuff out at my Idaho Vandal. I don't know what's going on here.
Go Vols. He's still, are you still really active on some of those other social media platforms that we talked about earlier?
Oh my gosh. John Denver's platform, Take Me Home Country Road? No, we're not. Hayes, you're killing me, Smalls.
So, Hank, I know you've never been on this show before, but this is what it's like. I got to tell you, this is, I'm on all of them. This one is a lot of fun. We got a great sense of humor amongst this team.
I mean, he's just he's like a MySpace junkie. He just hangs out
MySpace.
there. Yeah,
you realize half of our audience doesn't even know what MySpace is.
Well, good thing Gary can tell you. I mean, he knows all about it. That and Vine and what else are you on?
Easy. My dial-up and my DSL can't take all your information, Hayes. So slow down.
Getting with the times.
Your AOL account. Yeah.
Webcrawler.com, baby. Webcrawler.com.
We do have a good time
what's
here.
unique about Hayes is, Hayes and I have been connected for a number of years prior to the launch of Power Supply, and I think prior to the launch of Beyond Clean, honestly, just because we were active in that LinkedIn space. I know Hayes, even back through the years, we've had a number of conversations specifically about, hey, what kind of content is happening here on LinkedIn? How are you creating content? Why are you creating content? I know we've learned a lot from each other, so it's kind of cool to see you on the other side of the podcast here.
Well, this has been a blast for me. And I say this, we do joke a lot. Obviously, I love Gary. I mean, most of the time I love Gary, but, y'all have been great, but literally it's just been a great opportunity. It has, and again, I've never done the true podcasting. And so having guys like you who truly have expertise, who've done a great job on the social, I've learned so much and had a blast. And what's kind of cool, I feel like we just got started. I feel like, just with some of the things we're doing with ARM now, I feel like it's getting ready. We've been building the airplane, right? And now we're jacking up the engines and we're getting ready to take off. And I hope anybody that's listening to us, again, helps us out, gives us, ideas for content, speakers, presenters, whatever it takes. Let us know, because we're doing it for you guys. We're doing it for the industry. And, that's what I enjoy about it.
Yeah, that's a conversation that we've had on the other podcast a number of times in saying, hey, are we ever going to run out of content? And the answer is no, because we're never going to run out of people. And you can talk about the same, issue around negotiating contracts or GPOs with two different people, and you're going to have two very different but very educational interviews and conversations. And again, that's what it's about. And that's what social media is about too. Going back to that point, you're not talking to computer screens and you're not engaging with, servers. There's people on the other ends of those profiles who got real lives and real jobs and got real responsibilities in supply chain or sterile processing. And if you reach one of those and you change how they lead their department or their health system, just imagine the impact. It's tremendous.
All right, Hank, great job. Really, I can't believe it took us 2 years to have you on this podcast, considering you're a founder.
Well, thanks, Justin. It's been an honor, as I said, to see you guys grow. I appreciate the fact that all three of you've got tremendous insight into supply chain. I think that's why this platform has grown as well as it has. Like, people like coming on and talking to people who know what they're talking about and learning from them. But also, and this is where we shine as well, as we know what we don't know. And that's what these interviews are about, is learning at the same time that the audience is learning. How can we lead better? How can we do better? How can we encourage the industry? And as long as you guys keep doing that, I know you're going to continue to succeed.
You teed up our final episode of the season with Bob Yokel so well by saying we know what we don't know, because he's going to tell us we don't know what we don't know. And that's why we go and search for that information. Hank, great job today. Hank Balch, founder and president of Beyond Clean, and that podcast brand, our sister podcast, focused on sterile processing. And Hank gave us a vision for the power of social media, but also some good takeaways on sterile processing and where there are needs for innovation in that department that can bring operational efficiencies and potential savings as well. And I think he did a nice job of drawing parallels, Gary, between supply chain and sterile processing and kind of the emergence and awareness of those departments in healthcare where maybe we were tucked away in the basement before.
I think you're right. Just hearing Hank speak and you two actually going back and forth and supporting Hayes and I, identifying that gap of where we get the information. Like you talked about the pandemic, where were people going to get this information? They weren't going to conferences. This is a social medium that is content driven right now, and it's just going to keep happening. I think there's so many different paradigms that Hank talked about on supply chain where we can go. We're never going to run out of content, and we're going to hit those key indicators I think are relevant to supply chain. So I was just truly impressed at obviously what Hank and you have started and brought Hayes and I into this to keep it moving forward on, the social media platform with Power Supply. And hopefully we can trend at where Beyond Clean has gone. Amazing steps. So very excited to see where our future takes us.
All right, everybody. Well, you can follow Power Supply if you're not already on social media, since that was the main topic along with sterile processing of the conversation today, simply by going to LinkedIn and searching for Power Supply. We'd love it if you shared out the posts, commented on it especially. We were talking about, getting engagement and the power of networking and finding that content. So make sure that you like, share, and comment on the posts on LinkedIn and or Facebook. Definitely download our smartphone app. And if you do want to learn more, you can send us an email to info@powersupplymedia.net. On behalf of Gary, Hayes, and myself, thanks for listening to this episode of Power Supply.